We're delighted to be hosting tonight's webinar as part of our International Women's Day celebrations. Professor Emerita Valerie Bryson has published extensively on feminist theory and politics, and her new book, The Futures of Feminism, is the focus of our discussions this evening. However, before we start, we'd just like to acknowledge the tragic murder of Sarah Everard. A terrible event at any time, but particularly poignant given the context of International Women's Day. Our thoughts go to her family and friends. We're thrilled to be joined by several inspirational women. Activist and actor Julie Hesmond-Halche, Adele Jones OBE, our Professor of Social Work and Director of the Non-in-3 Research Centre for the Global Prevention of Gender-Based Violence, and Kim Leadbeater, MBE, Ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, which was set up after the murder of her sister, Jo Cox, MP. Kim is spokesperson for the Great Get Together, an annual weekend of community events across the UK held in June. Julie will be reading extracts from Valerie's book, which have particular resonance for her, and both Adele and Kim will discuss their own work, which relates to some of the themes arising from the book. I'm also delighted to welcome our undergraduate student studying politics and sociology, Isma Rashid. Isma is currently the Students' Union Women's Network Assistant and does a huge amount of work to facilitate and to empower women and to tackle gender inequalities. Isma will be helping to facilitate the question and answer session towards the end of the webinar. So please do pop any questions or comments in the chat and one of the team will pick them up. We'll also be using the chat function to provide you with information throughout the evening, including a list of support services in case you are affected by any of the topics discussed. So without further ado, hello and welcome Valerie, and congratulations on the launch of your new book, The Futures of Feminism. In many ways, this book is the culmination of a long career writing about feminism. So how have your ideas developed over time?
Thank you, Georgina. I actually came quite late to feminism. I didn't call myself a feminist until my late 20s. I didn't publish anything at all on anything until my mid-40s, when my book on feminist political theory came out. And my feminist ideas, as they've developed, aren't just about me. They're part of more collective experiences and developments, reflect the times I've lived through, the general political climate, developments in feminist theory and politics, as well as my own experiences, which include the enormous importance of female friendship. My own pivotal moments were joining a feminist women's group in the late 70s and starting to teach on feminism from the late 1980s. I've learned a lot from my students over the years. My own degree was in politics. It was taught by men entirely. All the books I read were by men, and it was entirely about men as politicians or political theorists. I somehow failed to notice this. It just seemed to be the way of the world. I was then intermittently quite a serious young woman, and my academic interest was mainly in political theory, the big ideas behind politics. I wasn't so much interested in these ideas as ends in themselves, but a way of understanding the world in the hope of making it just a little bit better. And I sometimes imagined that if I read enough and thought enough and lived long enough, I'd find out the answers. Well, I've read quite a lot, thought quite a bit, and lived quite a long time, and I still haven't got very far. This could be because I've also frequently been distracted, often for years at a time, by real life or what to have for dinner, important things, little things. Or it could be that it's simply all too complicated. And today, I certainly think that the human world is far too complicated and its problems far too great for any kind of magic bullets. Everything interconnects with everything else, so there are no simple solutions to all the problems of the world. But there are obviously also patterns. Our lives and experiences are not totally random, and different forms of inequality and injustice and oppression are built into societies. good feminist theory can expose the gendered nature of these patterns, and it can also suggest ways that they might be challenged and changed. And because the world is complicated, feminist theory can sometimes be difficult. And sometimes I think it's needlessly difficult with a language that alienates the women it's supposed to be speaking for. And I've always believed that my job as a writer and a teacher is to try to make these theories as accessible as possible. And this is one of my aims in this new book. And I've also found that after a time, that ideas that seemed unfamiliar and difficult to me can seem like statements of the blindingly obvious that everybody thinks. They kind of come down to earth. But sometimes ideas that once seemed comfortable and familiar can seem totally inadequate or even part of the problem they're trying to address. And since I started calling myself a feminist, I've changed my ideas in two main ways. I've always thought of myself as a socialist feminist, and I've always been aware of the inequalities based in class as well as gender. But at first, I didn't fully appreciate the extent to which other inequalities are built into society and how they can change the very meaning of what it means to be a woman. And in particular, I didn't fully see that when I thought I was writing about feminism, I was actually writing as a white woman about mainly white European and US-based feminisms. Since then, I've read a lot of Black feminist theory, which I hope has changed my understanding for the better and made my feminism more inclusive. The other key change in my thinking, reflecting both my own experiences and developments in feminist theory and practice, has been to see that human societies are fundamentally dependent on the care that is mainly provided by women. I'll return to this later in the evening.
Thanks, Valerie. I think that gives us a really clear sense of your trajectory over time. But I wonder where your ideas came from for this particular book.
Well, I didn't intend to write it, I can tell you that. I had plans for a peaceful retirement, but I somehow got into it and I was motivated by two things. First, I wanted to reassert the argument for the kind of socialist feminism that puts the most disadvantaged women at its heart. And this is very different from the kind of feminism represented by our Prime Minister and his predecessor. Yep, both Boris Johnson and Theresa May describe themselves as feminists, even though their party's policies have done so much damage to so many women. My second motivation for writing the book was to try to find ways forward beyond the increasingly divisive nature of some feminist disagreements. These disagreements are often exaggerated and encouraged by both mainstream and social media. A catfight amongst women is always newsworthy, whether it's young women rejecting older feminists, or Black feminists accusing white feminists of racism, or stay-at-home mums accusing career-oriented women of selfishness. Against all this, I tried to argue that we must recognize that things are complex and complicated and open up attempts at dialogue and reconciliation rather than just shouting each other down and shutting the debate down. And today, the most toxic disputes amongst feminists are those between some trans women and their supporters and some feminists. I've got a long chapter in the book on this, and my aim, as throughout the book, is to look beyond divisions and try to find sources of unity that we might perhaps build on.
There's a lot of really important messages there, Valerie, but if we had to pin you down, and if there was just one message you wanted readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
I think I might just have time for two short messages. The first is that feminists should logically be socialists, because if you really want to make life better for most women, you have to challenge and change a system in which most people, men as well as women, can only be losers. The second message is that socialists, men and women, should logically also be feminists, because feminism is not a luxury. It's not just something for white middle-class women, and women's issues are not something to be set aside until more important problems have been addressed. I'd say that women's issues are of central importance to the welfare and survival of the whole society, Feminist perspectives can help us see things that are invisible to mainstream politicians and thinkers, and this can be a first step towards changing the world for the better.
Thanks, Valerie. An optimistic note, I think, there.
Right.
I'd now like to welcome Julie and invite her to introduce the book and to reflect on how it has spoken to her.
Thank you, Georgina. Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. I do realise it might seem a little bit random, me being part of this event tonight. So full disclosure, I am Valerie's neighbour. I've read her book and I absolutely loved it. So that's why I'm here to provide a brief introduction to and an appreciation of her book and how it spoke to me. So there'll be a lot of talk about intersectionality tonight. And rather than that being, as Valerie at first feared, a bit of passing feminist jargon, it's actually central to the ideas that she puts forward in the futures of feminism. Just as patriarchy is a multifaceted system that interconnects with other structural inequalities, gendered inequality also intersects with other disadvantages and oppressions, for example, race, class, and disability. I am a socialist, and this seems to me to be a timely and deeply socialist book. The writer is highly critical of neoliberalism and profit-driven systems, but is fair-minded in her assessment of the advances that a latter-day liberal, fashionable women's movements have undoubtedly made. But she consistently encourages us to go deeper and to check that in embracing individual glass ceiling busting successes, we are not participating in the exploitation of other women, or propping up and supporting systems that lead to inequalities that will always disadvantage women the most. The notion of a successful career woman eschewing housework and caring roles for more fulfilling and economically viable work feels pretty hollow if those less fulfilling roles get outsourced to other women who work for low or no pay and little or no job security. Her eye is always on economic disadvantage and, crucially, the policies of austerity, of which there are many more to come for sure post-COVID. And these will more often than not disproportionately affect women who are, of course, more likely to be engaged in lower paid, part-time, insecure and agency type work to fit around unpaid and often undervalued caring responsibilities. We need to be checking ourselves as feminists that we're not speaking or acting for all women, as has happened too frequently in the past, but with them. And those with a platform should use it to make space for the voices of those who have traditionally been excluded or unheard. Single issue campaigns have done much in recent years to highlight misogyny, inequality, injustice, but we should also be looking to dismantle the structures that allow those oppressions to exist in the first place. It's not enough to just work towards having more women occupying powerful positions, getting the same huge bonuses as men in the same old unequal world with its ever-widening gap between rich and poor. A socialist approach recognises, quote, the reality of human interdependence and the consequent need for value systems based on solidarity, cooperation, and the collective good, rather than individual satisfaction, a big one for modern feminism, and the pursuit of short-term profit, a big one for neoliberalism. The importance of such non-capitalist values was highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, as individuals were asked to make enormous financial sacrifices, to surrender taken for granted freedoms, and in the case of many key workers, to risk their lives in the interests of wider society. Collective thinking and increased public spending are also offered up as potential solutions in the increasingly fraught conversations within the women's movement around trans rights and the Gender Recognition Act. No conversation about the future of feminism could avoid this topic, which has caused so much division and hurt, exacerbated, in my view, by a media that revels in open warfare and encourages binary thinking at the expense of thoughtful debate. These disputes, as Valerie says in her dedicated chapter on the issue, are taking up the political energies of people who otherwise have much in common. And where differences are evident, she argues with great compassion for an approach that embraces intersectionality again, accepting, that neither cis or trans women constitute a singular interest or identity, rather both are coalitions of women whose interests and allegiances cut across any idea of a binary division. Looking forward to what's next for the movement, Valerie asserts in the final pages of the book that she doesn't believe that we're at a fork in the feminist road, for, as she writes, there are many routes to a more equal society that recognises the value of cooperation and care, and that does not reduce human society to the competitive pursuit of economic gain, regardless of the consequences. We may, however, she continues, be at some kind of tipping point, and different forms of feminist activism can be seen as complementary rather than in competition with each other, often with cumulative effects. The existence of multiple forms of activism also guards against the danger that those who have reached positions of power and influence are sucked into conventional ways of thinking, that they assume that they have all the answers. Instead, they should remember the message of intersectional theory, that if we focus on the most privileged women, society as a whole can stay much the same. But if our starting point is those that are multiply deprived, then the whole system will have to change. I love this. Beyond this, she writes, feminists will inevitably continue to disagree over their priorities, their methods, and the kinds of change they want. Here, it's important to see the value of difference and not let disagreements escalate into divisions that set feminists against each other and lose sight of more important shared goals. Above all, we need to remember that, in the words of Jo Cox, we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than things that divide us. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panellists tonight how these principles are being turned into real life activism out in the wider world. Thank you. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Julie, for that beautiful intertwining of your own reflections with words from Valerie's book. That was absolutely super. I'm going to turn now back to Valerie to talk in her own words about some themes within the book.
Thank you, and thank you, Julie. That was fantastic. The title of this whole thing is Who Needs Feminism? To which my short answer is the whole world needs feminism, but it needs to be an inclusive socialist kind of feminism. And my long answer is too complicated to go into tonight. In the first 3 chapters of my book, I argue that feminist language and concepts can help us all see the world more clearly and provide a practical toolkit for feminist politics. These concepts are not just fluffy things up there, they can actually be used. And these concepts help frame my 4th chapter on trans women and feminism. In the rest of my book, I link different kinds of feminism to the global capitalist system and the ideologies that support it. So I try and make these clear, and I suggest how feminists might move beyond current divisions. But tonight, I'm going to focus on some themes from my early chapters around feminist language and concepts and how they can help us see the world. Long ago, when I was growing up, there was no easy way of recognizing, let alone complaining about, things like sexism or sexual harassment, because these words did not exist. Girls were taught that there were a few depraved sex monsters around, so that we had to watch how we dressed and where we went. But few of us connected this to the fact that lots of normal men felt free to shout out comments, favourable or unfavourable, on our appearance when we walked down the street, and we didn't really question what it was up to us to avoid trouble. And lucky girls like me had no idea that some other girls were being abused by men in their own homes. Much of this probably hasn't changed as much as I had hoped. And we had no way of connecting any of this to how women were paid and treated at work, the fact that there were only a tiny handful of MPs then, or that when women occasionally appeared in newspapers, they tended not to be wearing many clothes. When I was later on in a feminist group in the late 1970s, I started to understand that different forms of bad treatment in different areas of our lives were connected. But there was no easy way of expressing these connections until I came across the concept of patriarchy. This was then a relatively new feminist concept that saw the world through women's eyes and joined the dots to show that different kinds of bad treatment and different kinds of male power and privilege were all connected in politics, in social life, economic, private and cultural life. They were all part of the same picture. But because it was everywhere, this inequality, this power had become taken for granted, as invisible, as natural as the air we breathe. We didn't have a name for it, we couldn't see it. But when we had the word patriarchy, some people talked about the clique experience when things fell into place. And the term patriarchy helped us to see, for example, that sexual violence is part of a wider pattern of power. It also showed us that if we want to understand why women are paid less than men, we don't just look at what's going on in the workplace. We also need to know, quite obviously, who's doing most of the unpaid work at home and how gender stereotypes are created and enforced. You can't isolate one area of life from the others. And the concept of patriarchy doesn't say that all men are privileged oppressors and all women are powerless victims. But it does say that we all live in a world in which men are usually treated as normal and women are optional extras. For example, we have history and women's history. And we also have normal workers who are men or women who can behave much like men, and women workers who have a tendency to do inconvenient things like having babies or wanting to work shorter hours. This means that even when women are allowed to compete with men, they have usually only been able to compete on terms that men have already set. Anything different about women, like giving birth or spending more time looking after people, is something that holds them back rather than something to be rewarded. During my lifetime, these competitive terms have begun to change. For example, most workers are entitled to some kind of maternity or parental leave. However, the last year has shown how fragile many of the gains have been, as women workers have generally taken on far more domestic responsibilities than men during lockdown, and they've been far more likely to lose their jobs. Today, patriarchy is widely used, but it's also often dismissed as an old-fashioned white feminist idea from the 1970s. However, I think it remains an important starting point, so long as it is combined with the idea of intersectionality, which Julie has already spoken about a bit, and the insight it can provide. And Adele's going to look at what an intersectional approach can mean in practice. The term, which is certainly a bit of a mouthful, was first used by Black feminists in the United States to capture the way that Black women were being sidelined and ignored in progressive political movements that focus on gender or race, forgetting about the specific experiences of those that were oppressed in both systems at once and somehow became invisible. Feminism was about white women, anti-racism stuff was about Black men. Black women somehow disappeared. Since then, the term has become widely used by white as well as Black feminists. Sometimes it's been watered down and some Black women have complained they've been written out again. But the central message that women are not all the same has been increasingly central to much feminist activism and analysis. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed decades of progress towards gender equality for all groups of women. But this doesn't mean that all women are in this together. The feminist economists have used an intersectional approach to unpack the general statistics comparing women and men. And they show clearly that it is those women who are already experiencing multiple intersecting disadvantages, such as poor women, migrant and refugee women, disabled women, or Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. They are the women who have suffered the worst economic effects. Better off women have been inconvenience. Sometimes they've been held back in their careers, but they haven't suffered quite such bad effects. As the cliche goes, we'll have to build back better as we emerge from lockdown. There is much talk amongst politicians and trade unions about the need to rescue the aviation industry, or to get going with shovel-ready projects and to create more apprenticeships for young people. There's also talk about the need for a green recovery, creating a more sustainable infrastructure and better insulated homes. At this point, I think we need to go a bit further, take an imaginative leap and think from the perspective of disadvantaged women about how we can promote social welfare and build a more sustainable economy without destroying the planet. As feminist economists and campaigners have pointed out, there is one large sector of employment that is valuable in itself, essential in any economic recovery, and a very green source of employment. It's also a sector in which many businesses are facing bankruptcy and closure, even though their services are desperately needed, and where there are currently over 100,000 job vacancies, probably because pay is low and conditions of employment are generally poor. Feminist economists have calculated that if we were to invest in this sector, we could create nearly 3 times as many jobs as investing in construction. This sector is paid care, both childcare and elder care, and it seems largely invisible to most economists and politicians. And we can also add in all the other people work. We make it an even bigger sector, which seems less important to politicians than physical construction and things. The social workers, the counsellors, the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, it's people work. It's not production, it's not growth. It's just giving people what they want and what they need, but it's not what really counts somehow. For a time during the first lockdown, which seems a long time ago, remember, we all clapped for carers. It seemed that care was being appreciated and some things might change. But this certainly hasn't translated into financial reward for care workers or support for care companies. Today, there seems to be a looming crisis in paid care provision, and it's usually women who will have to pick up the pieces and fill the gaps. Neglect of the sector is partly because care is a cosily familiar word. It's something we associate with love and kindness rather than money. And it's something that is generally the responsibility of women. Like many other feminists today, I argue that care must also be seen as a form of work, often hard and time-consuming and sometimes boring work, whether or not it is paid for and whether or not it is motivated by love and whether or not you enjoy doing it, it's work. Even the most independent person needed care when they were born. Most of us will need it at other stages of our lives. A good society is not one of competitive, isolated individuals, but one in which people can take time to think about other people. In a good society, care work should be seen as a properly paid career for both men and women. And sometimes it will be provided by family or friends. People should not be penalised if they do this essential, time-consuming work. The benefit system should recognise that people can contribute to society even when they are not in paid employment. And paid employment should be reorganised to recognise that normal workers have a life and responsibilities outside the workplace. Care also needs to extend beyond our own immediate concerns. The pandemic has shown how interconnected the whole world is. We have a collective interest in protecting others and caring for the environment rather than sacrificing everything to short-term profitability and growth. These changes are in the long-term interests of women, men, society, and the climate. The whole world, I would say, needs this kind of feminism. Thank you. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Valerie. A timely discussion, I think, of the many ideas and concepts that anybody needs in a feminist toolkit. So thank you for that discussion. I'd now like to welcome our Professor of Social Work and Director of the Non-in3 Research Centre for the Global Prevention of Gender-Based Violence, Adele Jones, who is going to discuss her own work, which speaks to some of the themes in Valerie's books. Thanks, Adele.
Thank you very much, Georgina, and happy International Women's Week, everybody. Wonderful to be with this amazing group of women. When I was young, I remember wondering why feminism did not speak for me, why it did not look like me, and why, though I shared its ideals, it didn't share mine. Early feminism would have me diminish the journey my ancestors had taken, and it would have me thinking I lived in a different world to the one I really inhabited. And I'm sure I wasn't alone. I don't want you to understand me. I wanted to declare myself a feminist. In fact, I often did. I agreed with much feminist analysis, and I believed in feminism. And yet I could never quite shake off the feeling that the feminists I met didn't believe in me. Mostly I felt invisible, and Valerie has alluded to this. And if I was seen, too often it was as a threat. I remember as a young academic making a stand with Black students against racism, only to find myself on the receiving end of a backlash by white women in the department. I wondered how it could ever be okay for one group to feel that the discrimination they faced meant they were beyond discriminating against others. I found my answers in the writings of women such as Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, June Jordan, Heidi Mirza, and Amina Mama. I found my political footing and cut my political teeth on their words. I now understood why Alice Walker coined the term womanism, in opposition to a feminism that seemed preoccupied with the interests of white middle-class women. And I understood why Audre Lorde felt compelled to write, "When radical lesbian feminist theory dismisses us, it encourages its own demise." I carried the feeling that feminism was in demise for years, right until I stumbled upon the concept of intersectionality. Since then, intersectionality has been the route through which I have been able to expand my own versions of feminism, and in doing so to reclaim my space and peace as a feminist, and to find amongst my allies white feminists as dedicated to my causes as I am. While there will always be many feminist ideas, even conflicting ideas, the future of feminism lies not in being fractured, but in being inclusive. We should not encourage our own demise. As the director of the Non-in-3 Research Center, we undertake global work. We're currently working in 8 countries, and it is intersectionality that underpins all that we do. This has driven us to fight for funds to tackle child marriage in Uganda, while at the same time confronting dating violence in the UK or online sexual exploitation in Brazil. While gender-based violence is universal, tackling it requires a deep understanding of the context in which it arises and of how it intersects with other sources of oppression. 40 years ago, Audre Lorde wrote, "The oppression of women knows no racial or ethnic boundaries, but this does not mean it is identical within these differences." She was right. In the Caribbean, intersectionality helped us understand the abuse experiences of women living with HIV. The women we interviewed faced physical and sexual violence and economic abuse too. But they also lived with the constant fear that their partner would disclose their HIV status or flush their medication down the toilet. The stigma of HIV can destroy a life. The stigma, not the virus, will affect your job, perhaps whether you work at all, your friendships, and the personal safety of you and your children. Threatening disclosure was psychological torture that left women with a heightened level of anxiety and forced them to retreat from their families and friends. 56-year-old Agnes, who got HIV from her husband, described how he continually mocked her and threatened to tell their friends. He started insulting me in public, like he would make a big fuss about not using the same glass or fork. Everybody would hear him, and you could see what they were thinking. I asked him, please don't say that. They will think I have some terrible disease. And he would say, well, you do have a terrible disease. It turns out then that HIV stigma can be as much a tool of patriarchal domination as is the fist. In our study with disabled women, Joan, who was blind, said when her husband wanted to punish her, he would move the furniture around so she would stumble and fall. It turns out then that the weaponization of a woman's impairment by her abuser is an insidious yet powerful means by which she can be controlled. In this example, our policy recommendations focused less on getting accessible courts and refuges, important though these things are, than on the barriers to disabled women's autonomy, economic and otherwise. Our research with gay women revealed that their relationship abuse was met largely with derision by professionals. And in a singular display of state-inflicted violence, a newly enacted domestic violence law was designed specifically to exclude them. When confronted, the government minister proudly asserted that lesbians would only be included over his dead body. He should watch out. These were some powerful women. There is nothing exceptional about these stories, for there is nothing heroic in surviving violence. One just does. But they are untold stories. Stories made possible because intersectionality illuminates the differences contained within this universal problem. I believe also that intersectionality requires that we talk to men. For how can we find out how power collides and when it collides in the abuse of women if we don't check its sources? Most recently, my colleagues in the UK discovered that racism is a barrier to services and justice for women from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. But this is not a new discovery. As a member of a Black women's cooperative in Moss Side, we were fighting this problem in the early 80s. Mainstream feminism did not see then that to protect women from domestic abuse, you might have to also campaign for their citizenship rights. We did. I was one of the many Black women who placarded and protested the treatment of women who, having left their violent husbands, were then put into holding centers so they could be deported and forcibly separated from their children. You can imagine then how deeply depressing it is to learn over 30 years later that the domestic abuse bill currently being debated in Parliament disregards the specific needs of migrant women. In an act of political solidarity, a coalition of more than 50 Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, migrant, and women's rights organizations have accused the government of placing the lives of these women at serious risk, and their activism has forced a rethink. As Julie said, feminism is nothing without activism, and this, dear friends, is what inclusive activist feminism looks like. Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you, Adele, for bringing to life for us the power of the concept of intersectionality, and for sharing those untold stories, which I think highlight the powerful and transformative work of the Non-in3 Research Centre. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to now welcome Kim Leadbeater, MBE, Ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, to discuss her own work, which ranges from engaging with Westminster to volunteering with local communities across the UK and locally here in Kirklees. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you very much, Georgina, and thank you so much to Valerie and Julie and Adele for their really powerful contributions this evening. I'm feeling quite overwhelmed, if I'm honest, so I'm gonna give my bit a good old go. It really is an honour to be invited to be part of such a great event, and what a week to talk about feminism. As has been said already, in June 2016, my life was torn apart and changed forever when my sister Jo Cox was murdered whilst going about her duties as the MP for Batley and Spen here in West Yorkshire, where I am today and where myself and my parents still live. And I'm pleased to say that Jean and Gordon are tuning in tonight. They're with us, girls, they're with us. So we're not far from Huddersfield University, who are the fabulous hosts of tonight's event. When something so horrific and truly unbelievable happens, everything that you think you know and understand changes. And my life is not and will never be the same again. And I'm very aware that I've got a huge amount of work to do in terms of processing what has happened. But my approach since that horrific day has been to keep as busy as possible and to use my precious time to focus on doing as much as I can to create a powerful legacy for my sister by generating as much positive energy and action as I possibly can. And there are lots of ways I try and do that, including through my roles as an ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, the charity we set up after Jo was killed, and as chair of a wonderful group of volunteers I work with here in West Yorkshire. And in my role as an ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, I get asked to do all sorts of things on all sorts of subjects with all sorts of people and organisations, which I think is testament to the wide variety of things that Jo was involved with, the wonderful woman that she was, and also the amount and range of things that we have done through the work of her foundation since her murder. So when I was asked to be part of this event, I went to my default position, and I'm sure many of you will recognise this. Yes, of course I can do that. Now, I do this a lot, and after I've sent the email or I've put the phone down, I think, okay, Kim, what have you agreed to now? But this was very Jo, and it was very me, instinctively seeing that something was the right thing to do and maybe the way of making a difference, and then worrying about the plan and the detail later. So here I am, feeling a little bit out of my depth, but also absolutely delighted to be part of such a great event and to share a platform with a group of such inspirational women. So feminism. Well, after I agreed to take part in this panel, as I say, I started to think about what I'd signed up for. Who needs feminism? Well, I am no expert, but my other instinctive response was, well, surely everyone needs it. So I have no idea how they're going to spin this out for 90 minutes. But then I thought, well, these people are experts and they know what they're doing, so there's got to be more to it than that. And indeed, obviously there is. Jo was once asked, what kind of feminist are you? And she replied, a massive one. And indeed, a huge amount of Jo's working life involved working on issues directly affecting women, from the maternal mortality campaign at the White Ribbon Alliance, working to stop millions of women and girls dying or suffering horrific injuries in pregnancy and childbirth, to holding various senior roles at Oxfam, including head of humanitarian campaigning, working on and in areas of conflict and humanitarian disaster, including Darfur, Afghanistan, DRC, Zimbabwe and Somalia, war zones and areas of extreme poverty where women were often the first to suffer. And then to politics. Jo became an MP to make a difference to the lives of people where we grew up. And she also did it to be a strong female voice in Westminster. She said, one of the reasons I'm entering politics is because only 23% of the House of Commons is female. If women don't make that 50-50, then the people taking decisions about our communities are never to be reflective of the needs. Now, in 2021, I'm pleased to say that this number has gone up to 34%, which is an all-time high, but we've still got quite some way to go to get equal representation. And this is something which everyone at the Jo Cox Foundation feels passionately about. And through Jo's Foundation, we do a lot of work on how we can encourage women to enter public life so that their voices can be heard, but also how we can make public life a safer place for women to be. It's worrying that the toxicity of our public and political discourse makes politics not only a scary place to be at times for women, but it's also hugely detrimental to increasing women's participation in politics. The abuse and intimidation they face at times is horrific, and this is very much an ongoing piece of work for us. Over the last few weeks, I've also asked myself, what kind of feminist am I? And I think I've realised, and some of you may be familiar with this podcast and book, I am probably a guilty feminist. Now, I have to confess that I haven't actually heard the podcast, and I haven't even read the book that someone bought me for Christmas, because like many guilty feminists, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't have time to read about feminism, or indeed to do much reading at all. And I carry this guilt with me every day. I haven't had time because I keep saying yes to doing lots of other things. Anyway, I dipped into the book and I really liked it because it was a combination of comedy and thoughtful discussion and observation of the paradoxes we often live with as women. And I also like the idea that's raised, which says you don't have to be perfect or even consistent to be a force for meaningful change. And I thought this was a really good message because I'm far from perfect and I'm probably pretty inconsistent a lot of the time, but I'm not going to let that stop me. So, along with Valerie's brilliant book, which it's clearly a given that you're all going to read, maybe try The Guilty Feminist too. I also got to thinking about our past. Where did Jo's feminism come from and where does my feminism come from? We were really lucky to have a brilliant childhood. We were brought up by two wonderful parents who always made us feel loved and valued and instilled in us a core set of values and beliefs. Our parents taught us to treat everyone with respect, compassion and kindness, and to try and empathise with the lives of others. Simple principles based around hard work, respect, equality, sometimes agreeing to disagree, compromising, and treating other people how you would wish to be treated. Focusing on inner happiness, not just material success and money. In true Yorkshire style, we were also taught, as I said on Newsnight recently, sometimes if you haven't got all good to say, keep your gob shut. But these things weren't drilled into us. They were more inherently included as part of everyday life, and they stayed with us both throughout our adult lives. And on reflection, although if I'm honest, I've probably never thought about it quite like this before, in the context of this event, we were never made to feel that it was anything other than a really positive and amazing thing to be a girl. Mum and Dad empowered us and never made us feel that there was anything that we couldn't or shouldn't have a go at. Although what I will say is, when we were young, Jo was actually really shy. And it may be difficult to believe that I was the gobby one when we were kids. And Jo would always push me forward to do even the smallest of things, like ringing up for a bus timetable or ordering a takeaway. And I think it's really honest to be important about that, because when we see women in public life, it's really easy to fall into the trap of assuming that they've always been supremely confident. And that's often not the case. Jo had to work really hard to develop her confidence over years and years. She'd ring me when she was on her way to meetings or speaking somewhere, full of self-doubt. I can't do it, I'm not good enough. The voices that so many of us have in our heads. So I would say, you can do it, Jo. You are amazing, you are wonderful, you are powerful and you are strong. And you've got just as much right to be there as anybody else. And interestingly, I've had lots of those conversations with myself over the last few years. I never really struggled with confidence when I was younger, but Jo's murder has shaken it to the core. I initially doubted myself at every corner. And I've also had to work really hard to rebuild my confidence. And I guess a lot of that is probably trauma and maybe the effects of shock. But it's put me in a place where I've never really been before and made me appreciate how debilitating self-doubt can be. And this is also very much a work in progress for me still. I've done 2 speaking engagements this week and I've been incredibly nervous about both. And I want people to know that, because invariably afterwards someone will say to me, "Oh, you didn't seem nervous at all." Well, I was, and I am, and I'm still a bit shaky. But I believe that being a role model for other women is about admitting this. And it's also about challenging myself to step outside of my comfort zone, whether that's sitting on a hugely impressive panel like tonight, or attending meetings with politicians in Westminster, or going on live TV, whether it's Sky News or Loose Women, which I have done a couple of times. So we've got to be honest, I think, and open about our own sort of vulnerabilities. And my other response to preparing today was a good example of this. So the voices in the Head Start. "You don't know anything about feminism." Yes, but my sister was a massive feminist. And I've got loads of friends who are feminists. My best friend, who is also on the call tonight, she's a really good one. She does loads of really good feminist stuff. And I also work with amazing women at the Jo Cox Foundation. Yeah, but you're going to sit on a panel with a bunch of brilliant women who know far more than you do, and you're going to be totally out of your depth. Yeah, but I've got some really valuable lived experience, and that needs to be talked about. Yeah, but these women have written books. You can't even find time to read one. And so it goes on. The last thing I want to say, just briefly, is more really of a thank you than anything else to the many, many amazing women who have been a fundamental and vital part of Jo's legacy. I'm not going to name names, as there are way too many, but from Parliament to communities across the UK and beyond, women around the world have rolled their sleeves up and supported me and my family in making many amazing things happen, inspired by Jo and in her name. Whether that's through organising events on the weekend of the Great Get Together, the weekend of community activity that we organise on what would have been Jo's birthday in June, standing for public office, working on the issues Jo cared about, be it Syria, civility in public life, or loneliness, or setting up more in common groups to bring people from different backgrounds together in their local communities. I salute and thank you all. The world needs women like you. We have, I have to also say, done our work alongside a brilliant bunch of men too, and I would like to give them a big shout out this evening. So my final message to finish: be the change that you want to see in the world. Be a role model to other women, and indeed men. Be a strong, resilient, powerful woman, but also be kind to yourself. Look after the basics of your health: sleep, nutrition, stress, hydration, physical activity. And don't be afraid or embarrassed about asking for support when you need it, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And as I'm still trying to put into practice myself, asking for help is a strength and not a weakness. Because we all need feminism, but we also all sometimes need a helping hand, no matter how fierce a feminist you are. Thank you very much. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Kim. We are so grateful to your instinctive response to say yes. And if it makes you feel any better, I'm sure we've all been sat here silently shaking as well. But thank you so much for those insightful reflections on feminism, for sharing your personal stories about Jo and your family, and for sharing the amazing work that you do with the Jo Cox Foundation. I'm sure we all found it absolutely insightful and very moving. So I'm now going to hand back to Julie before we go into the question and answer session. And Julie is going to read the conclusion to Valerie's book. So a real treat in store.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone tonight. It's been properly inspiring. I've absolutely loved it. So this is the concluding chapter to Valerie's fantastic book. Feminists are everywhere, from refugee camps to parliaments, from picket lines to academic conferences, and from playgrounds to the United Nations. Some are now in the corridors of power. Others are shouting loudly in the streets, and many are working quietly in their homes, their workplaces, their schools, and their neighbourhoods. Digital technology means that feminist actions and ideas in one part of the world can spread rapidly, and that feminists can draw inspiration and strength from one another. It also means that many women can easily access a ready-made feminist language that makes sense of their own experiences, helps them recognise the oppressive nature of some forms of male behaviour, and enables them to recognise and challenge apparently unrelated aspects of male power. Although feminists certainly do not rule the world, feminism has become a powerful political force, one that is increasingly difficult for political and economic leaders to ignore. At the same time, most of these leaders recognise only the most limited forms of feminism, and although they may support some feminist goals, they will do so only if they think this will be profitable and not too disruptive. I have argued throughout this book that feminist aims should be broad and inclusive, and that need to go far beyond the pursuit of equality on terms that men have already set. These existing terms reflect the assumptions of the man-made economic, social and political theories that dominate public discussion. Policies based upon them cannot deliver what most feminists want. These policies are also in danger of destroying the planet. The long-term goal of inclusive feminism would be a world that understands both the diversity of human experiences and the underlying human need for care. In a more inclusive version of an old socialist ideal, such a world would be governed by the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Meanwhile, the steps we take on this journey are as important as the final destination, and they should always be treated as such. They will often be taken in alliance with socialist men. They must always include the most disadvantaged women. They will never be taken entirely alone. Thank you, Valerie.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for writing that, and thank you, Julie, for reading that so beautifully. We're going to move now into a question and answer session. As you'd imagine, we've received lots of questions for our speakers, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we possibly can in the remaining time. I'm going to hand over to our undergraduate student, Isma, who is going to start facilitating the question and answer. Isma is one of our wonderful students, one of those young women who is lighting the world as she goes along. So over to you, Isma.
Thanks, Georgina. And thanks to everyone for their contributions and for the audience as well for your questions. As Georgina has just mentioned, I'm an undergraduate student here at the university, and I'm also part of the Student Union's Women's Network Assistant. So it really is a privilege to be here as part of the event. So the first question I'll direct to Adele on forced marriage. So forced marriage is a huge issue for women internationally with serious consequences for girls' health and education. Have you considered or been involved in any attempts to improve the figures? I've also heard that COVID could lead to a real step backwards in this area.
Thank you very much, Isma, and thank you to whoever posed the question. It is a very important question. Perhaps I could talk about, rather than talk about forced marriage, because we really don't have any even global estimates around forced marriage, but we do around child marriage. And anybody who is married off as a child is married against their informed consent, and I consider that forced marriage. And I would say that even before COVID, we anticipate, or we estimate, that 1 in 5 girls worldwide would be married off while they're still a child. And that's an improvement based on the work that's been going on over the last 10 years. It used to be 1 in 4. What I would say about COVID is that COVID has set that back. It's anticipated that of the 100 million girls that would have been forced into marriage over the next decade because of COVID, that has increased by an estimated 10 million. And that was based on research conducted by UNICEF, which was actually published on International Women's Day on Monday. So the figures are pretty startling. In terms of our own work, we started working with colleagues at Makerere University in Uganda nearly 4 years ago. And the people we work with, they decided that they wanted to focus on child marriage. It's one of the countries where the problem is very, very severe. And so we decided we would focus our gender-based violence research on child marriage and sexual coercion in that context. So yes, we are doing our work. We've conducted research with over 11,000 young people, which is huge. We've conducted qualitative research with survivors and people involved in child marriage, and we're also using the research. One of the things that we do in our research center is to use the research to create digital interventions that can be used in education settings to change the attitudes that fuel gender-based violence. So we are working, in fact, we're about to trial the game. We've developed a pro-social video game that will be used across Uganda once it's been trialed and proven to be effective. And this is based on early work that was funded by the European Union that was carried out in the Caribbean, where we demonstrated that this was a wonderful way of reaching potentially millions of young people, of engaging them in an immersive experience where we could begin to change things. So COVID has set us back, but I think there's a great awareness of that, and we just need to work harder, as simple as that. It's very difficult. We know that girls are forced out of school when we're only just getting girls into school in some countries, and a lot of families won't be in a hurry to send their girls back. The key thing to remember is that child marriage is not cultural. There may be cultural factors that inform it, but it's actually, it comes about because of poverty, because of economic disadvantage for the main part. There may be cultural factors that propagate it, but child marriage is actually a problem of the feminization of poverty worldwide. So thank you.
Thanks, Adele. I'll move on to the next question. I'll ask Valerie this. How can feminists save the planet?
That's a nice little question. How can feminists change the planet? It's an optimistic question, because it's assuming that this planet can be saved, we're not too late, and that it's feminists that are going to do it. And of course, the planet is in crisis, not just our little local problems at the moment, or international problem of COVID. We've been plagued in the past. We've got climate change, which may be the end of the planet as we know it, that humans can inhabit in any decent way. And we have all the problems that we've always faced of war and famine and poverty and inequality. The world is pretty much in a mess. And to say how a feminist is going to save it seems quite a big ask, really. Feminists certainly can't do it on our own, because although, as we know, there are more feminists in political power or getting a political voice than there ever have been. There are some feminists and some socialist feminists in parliament, at the tops of organisations, in positions of influence, but most feminists are not. So most ordinary feminists will have to go on doing what they do, of acting local but thinking global. But at the same time, we need to shout, we need to write to our members of parliament, we need to do whatever we can to draw attention to the underlying causes of the problem, rather than sticking little bits of sticking plaster on. We need to see the systems that are generating the crises. And feminists can't do it on their own. They need the support, particularly of socialist men. They need the support of leaders, of people in positions of power who are disproportionately still men. And they need to show that feminism can provide new ways of seeing the world. The world is in a mess, and we need to look at it differently. And we need to look at it not from the point of view of the privileged. Oh dear, we can't go on holiday anymore. Oh dear, we'll have to buy air filters. We'll have to have better kind of air conditioning. It's not like that. It's not a luxury problem. It's life and death for many people on the planet. We've got to see the world from the point of view of the people who are suffering, the people who will suffer more because of climate change is the number one problem. And I think we can send some messages and shout and hope that people will listen. And fundamentally, we can't continue with the present system. We can't go on prioritizing short-term profit over long-term needs. We have to think long-term. We have to think about solutions that can develop with people rather than being given to people. Things have to be the kind of things that Kim was talking about, that people are doing, women are doing, rather than imposing solutions on them. They can work things out for themselves, they can do things bottom up. But we also need to think collectively, not as individuals, not what's in it for us. We need to think collectively and we need to think globally. The pandemic has shown us, if nothing else, that our problems are global and they are interconnected. And we can build on existing institutions. We have international organizations. We're crawling towards some kind of agreements on preventing climate change, and then powerful countries are trying to wriggle out of it so they can compete and keep their competitive edge by having fewer environmental limitations than their competitors. We need to take these things seriously. A rich country, which we still are, despite all the poverty in our country, we're a rich country. We should be leading the world in terms of climate change, not just talking about it, but in terms of doing things. And there are signs of progress. There is a sense that we should have international cooperation. The woman whose name I can't remember, who's currently the head of the International Monetary Fund, second woman leader, is talking about the need for solidarity and the need for reducing inequality. Well, it's talk, but it's a step in the right direction. It wasn't the kind of thing the IMF used to be talking about. We need to sort out some of the other international crises, the international care crisis. There's problems for people in this country because nurseries are going bankrupt, parents can't cope at home, they've got work, they've got life, they can't balance the two. But it's an international problem because many poorer countries are exporting women who are leaving their families to go and work in richer countries where they're looking after children or working in nursing homes. So the rich countries, to some extent, can outsource their solutions to poorer countries, in the short term anyway. But the poorer countries are losing out. And the system we've got at the moment, the international capitalist system we've got at the moment, is insisting that everybody has to be in the paid workplace. Women and men have to be in the paid workplace, forgetting that what women used to do still needs to be done. Children still need to be brought up. Houses still need to be cleaned. Meals still need to be cooked. So there's a crisis there, and we should be nationally, internationally investing in care, not in military equipment and weapons of mass destruction. As some of us used to say back in the 80s when we were marching around Greenham Common protesting about nuclear weapons being based there, take the toys from the boys. We need to spend our money on what people need rather than what they might want. We need to rethink everything from the socialist perspective. Now, one man who thinks that feminists can save the planet, apparently, is our Prime Minister. A couple of years ago, Boris Johnson said he was a feminist, and he was a feminist because feminism is, I'm quoting here, literally the single magic bullet policy I've found in the last 20 years that really does address most of the problems of the world. And he said this is because if you educate girls and enable them to fulfill their potential, they can transform the world. Which seems to me a bit like saying, for thousands of years, we've been messing the world up. Come on, girls, you can have a go. You can clean the place up for us. But of course, it could be, or perhaps in the short term, he should be listening to some of the educated women in Parliament, educated women in his own party who are talking about institutional forgetfulness. that the cabinets and the top decision makers are forgetting about women. If you haven't got the women there, the men will just forget about things. And of course, it could be that if you do educate girls, they may grow up into socialist feminists. They might start saying that the solution is some kind of peaceful, green, global, socialist, feminist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist revolution to overthrow global capitalism and global patriarchal capitalism and all that goes with it. That might just happen. I don't know. I try to be an optimist. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. That was very insightful. Moving on to the next question, I'll direct this to Kim. So in my experience, the term feminism is now almost always viewed in a negative capacity by most people other than those who choose to either be a feminist or a follower of the feminist movement. Why do you feel that this is, and what needs to happen in order for it to be respected and viewed as positively as it once was?
Good question. Very good question. Yeah, I mean, hopefully tonight's event has done something to help with that, showing what feminism is really about. I think a few different things, really. I think education is really important. I think it's really important to be clear to people what feminism actually is and breaking down any misconceptions that people might have. And just, you know, we go back to the whole more in common ethos that Jo's Foundation works with. It's just about equality, and it's about everybody thinking about the things they have in common, being treated equally. So it's really sort of using simple language to explain that. I think often when I do stuff publicly, you know, people say, "Oh, I really understood what you meant. You didn't say anything that was too confusing, and it was too, you know, long words and stuff." So I think maybe we just need to get back to basics with what feminism really is about, and part of that is having that taught in schools. I think that's really important. So yeah, using simple language, being very clear about what it is, educating young people. And again, you know, putting it in relatable terms to men and women, that feminism is just about how your mothers and daughters and sisters and aunts and kids are all are treated by society. That's what it's really about. And once that, oh yeah, that makes sense to me now. And obviously there's so much more and there's so many more dimensions to it, but let's just go back to that basic fundamental principle. And I think that would hopefully help to engage more people. And again, you know, when you call something a movement, there's a sense of you're either in it or you're out of it. And actually feminism is everybody's business. So we need to try and sort of change that narrative a little bit, I think.
Thanks, Kim. That's excellent. I've got a few more questions. I'm going to try and ask each speaker one more question and then kind of see where we are in terms of time. So I'm going to put you on the spot, if I can, Julie, and just say, if you could give a young person one message or one feminist idea, what might it be?
Thanks for that, Georgina. That is quite on the spot. I suppose it would be, that what on earth would mean that we shouldn't be equal. Do you know? So in terms of talking to boys and girls, men and women about this, why on earth would we not be entitled to equal pay, equal rights, equality, the same level of justice? You know, why on earth should half the population not be able to walk out at night without fearing for their lives? You know, these are really, I mean, Kim touched on it, the common sense, everyday things, you know, that don't take a lot of imagination to put yourself in somebody else's shoes in that way. But on top of that, I do think that the stuff that we've talked about tonight is also very important in terms of recognising that it's a spectrum of disadvantage, so that, you know, we can, as you know, in weeks like this week, we can all stand together and say that, you know, we know what it is like. We know what it is like to be part of a gender that is fearful, that, you know, that can't go out, that has to watch ourselves all the time. But we can't always understand that within that there are levels, you know, Adele spoke so beautifully about refugee and migrant women and the way that they're treated not only by the wider public but by policy and by, you know, the way that COVID has affected, you know, the poorest people in our society, you know, the way that ordinary things are so inaccessible to people with disabilities, you know, the huge amounts of trans women who are experiencing violence, you know, all the time, you know, all these things are trying to expand our idea of what a woman is, and outside the simple view of what we see in the mirror, and try to think, you know, with empathy and compassion and solidarity with people across that spectrum, and understand that, yes, if things are hard, it might be harder for somebody else, and to always have an eye on that.
Thank you. That was beautifully put. So you can obviously think very much on your feet. I wish I could do that as well as you've just done it there. Valerie, I'm going to ask this question to you, and it's one that I want to ask given that we're in the School of Human and Health Sciences and many of our students are nurses. So the question is, as a nurse surrounded by men in senior positions, why is it that even in a female-dominated area, men still appear to be in senior management positions? Is this a result of patriarchy, or is it something deeper? If there is something deeper than patriarchy, I guess.
It's complicated. It's to do with what goes on in the workplace, who is doing the interviewing, what they're seeing as important characteristics of someone who is getting to be a senior manager, who's on the interviewing panel, how the candidates are presenting themselves in the workplace, whether the female nurses are more apologetic, less confident, whereas the men have a sense that, well, obviously I'm in this profession, obviously it's a career ladder, I'm going to go up there, I'm going to be a manager. And there's also what's going on outside the workplace and the constraints on women's lives. The fact that a lot of women nurses are much more likely than male nurses to have responsibilities outside the workplace, to feel that it's the kind of cliches about a mother feeling guilty if she doesn't take a child to school every day, and a father feeling wonderful because he does it twice a week. These responsibilities outside can hold people back at work. It's also to do with other things that may be going on in the workplace around how people are treated, how they feel safe, whether they feel safe, how patients assess them, and to do with the stereotypes that children were given when they were young, when little girls were taught that they should be nurses because they care for people, and that's the end of the story, and you care. Whereas boys were taught, when I was young, boys were certainly not taught that they can be nurses, but now they can be taught. They're taught it's a good career. You can go in there. They're keen to have more male nurses now, and that's a good career for you. So it is complicated, and it is because patriarchy is multi-dimensional. I'm not quite sure what might go deeper than it. So it's a good question. It's a pity is happening in a profession that was a really good profession for women. And I'm always arguing that care work should be better paid, should be a proper profession. But you don't want women who have succeeded in that profession to get pushed out when too many men enter it. Or when a lot of men enter it. You can't have too many men entering a profession as long as it's on grounds of equality, which are difficult to establish.
Thank you, Valerie.
That's a good question.
It's a very good question, very pertinent to our school, I think, given the high number of nursing students that we have here. Kim, I'm going to come to you and ask you a very short question, but maybe a difficult one to answer, is can men still be feminists?
Short question, short answer, yes. Of course they can. And this is one of the really important points, isn't it? I think, again, I don't have the history of feminism at my fingertips, but I think the danger is that it's perceived as being anti-men, pro-women, and it's not anti-men. And, and we need men in the feminist movement, don't we? We need men to be our allies and to support us and to be with us on the journey. That's really, really important. And it's like lots of other issues in life, isn't it? I'm not black, but I can be anti-racist. I don't have a disability, but I can fight for disabled people and stand by them and support them. It's like any other issue in life, isn't it? We have to go down to the fact that we're all human beings. Let's get back down to those really basic things in life, and we all have to support each other. That, I think, it's really, really simple for me. So absolutely. And, you know, I'm blessed to have had some amazing men in my life. You know, and my dad's been the first and foremost in that. But, you know, we've got an amazing team who work at the Jo Cox Foundation, and the men in that organisation are as important as the women. They're amazing, you know. So yeah, definitely. And I know it's hard, like, you know, some of the conversations that are taking place over the last sort of 24, 48 hours. I think sometimes it is hard for men because sometimes they're scared to say the wrong thing, so they don't say anything. And then if they do get it wrong, they get a lot of abuse. And I think that's a really tricky situation for men. So I do think we've also got to be supportive of men who do reach out and want to be feminists, you know, rather than sometimes thinking, oh, you've got it wrong, so you know, you're not in our team type thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you. I'm going to ask Adele this next question, but maybe other people on the panel, including Isma, might want to also kind of to answer this as well. And the question is, can the panel suggest what practical things we can do to promote feminism in our everyday lives? Adele.
I would, two things. I would say, don't be afraid of the label. I mean, labels come with their own challenges, and I understood what lay behind the question about feminism being perceived in a negative light. I've worked in parts of the world where to call oneself a feminist, you immediately get the glazed eyes and somebody switches off, and I think it's important just simply to reclaim it. And it's you know, I'm an anti-racist, I'm an activist, I'm a human rights this, I'm a this. It's fine, and whatever someone else thinks that is, that's for them to think. Don't be afraid to claim your space. It took me to discover intersectionality to be able to reclaim my space as a feminist, as I said. So don't be afraid of the word. That's not going to hurt you. It's other people's perceptions. And the other thing, you can change people's perceptions about feminism. And what I would say, the one single thing that you can do, be brave enough to stand up for somebody who is not like you, who is not in your world. And don't feel that you need to understand them and understand their world in order to do it. Don't wait until you have somebody who is disabled in your family or trans in your family, or you have a friend. Don't wait until you have the black friend or the this or the that. You make the stand. Be brave, go brave. It will not kill you. It will not harm you to stand up for somebody else. It may harm that person to stand up for themselves, but it will not harm you. And that's one very single practical thing absolutely everybody that can do. Stand up for somebody, stand with them. And it doesn't matter if they're not like you, better if they're not.
Thanks, Adele. Fantastic advice there. Valerie, I can see you. Did you want to come in on that?
I think Adele said so much so well. Can you repeat the question? Not that Adele wasn't answering it, but I've forgotten what it was.
Yeah, and this is for Kim and Julie as well, and Isma, if they want to come in as well, because it's quite a nice kind of, it feels like a positive question really about, you know, what we can do.
Oh, yeah.
And it's, can the panel suggest what practical things we can do to promote feminism in our everyday lives?
Yeah, I was thinking so hard about what Adele was saying, I sometimes forgot what the actual question was, and I wasn't thinking about how I might answer it. I've always found it's much easier to talk theory than to do things in practice. And when Kim was saying that she might feel that there were people here that had written books and therefore she might not be as worthy of being here or something, I feel the other way round. I feel all I can do is teach and read books. I'm not very good at doing the other stuff, and I feel really inadequate. I mean, there are things, it's to do with daily lives and the big things. So it's the obviously political things if you're in a position to do them, and if you're at work, through your work in your trade unions, and to do with how you bring up your children and how you interact with other people and what you let people get away with and what you don't, and the arguments you get into and the arguments you don't get into. It's it's always a difficult balancing act. I don't find it easy being a feminist. Lots of people who don't know me all that well don't kind of think of, oh, Valerie the feminist, because they don't actually know me well enough. That I'm just this, you know, quite quiet little woman. But and a very shy little, quiet little woman. So it's a range of things that people can do, from what you're doing in your very local community and to the bigger things. So it's, where do you start? And people will do different things, and you don't have to call yourself a feminist to do these things. I know women who do amazing things in local community, in food banks, that kind of thing, who are transforming other women's lives, but they're not saying I'm a feminist. They're just doing it. They're just getting on with it. And I think it's important, but it is also important to reclaim the label and use it. So it's both. Fine, if people don't want to call themselves a feminist, don't. But why don't you? And perhaps it gives you a sense of solidarity with other women. Not sisterhood, I think that's implying we're all the same, but solidarity with other women who may be differently situated.
Thank you. Julie, practical things we can do?
Well, I think that we exist in this system. We exist in a society that's based on capitalism. And I think that sometimes what's missed out of the conversation, obviously we want to dismantle the structures, so I'm right with Valerie on that. But where we are now is that, you know, there's educating girls globally, you know, and giving girls the means to be able to work, you know, is an economically really viable thing. You know, it's like, it's not just for the good of the girls and the good of the women. It's not just for a sort of like airy fairy idea of empowerment. It's about real life. It's about young people. You know, the COVID pandemic has been terrible for people who are already in vulnerable situations, particularly in the global south. You know, there will be more forced marriage. All the young girls who have had to leave education might not return to it. You know, we have to keep our eye on the ball with that. I'm sure that Adele would agree with me on this. You know, that the access to contraception and to safe legal abortion, all those things have been taken away. And I think that we just have to, you know, we have to make sure that girls are in education and that they're being looked after and having a childhood and an adolescence, and that they're able to be fully functioning members of our society, whatever that society is. And that's a real life thing. That's a real life, you know, it's not an airy fairy theory. It's about us, you know, keeping our eye on girls and women all over the world, and, you know, making sure that we're part of campaigns to keep those things happening, especially as we come out of this pandemic. It's really, really important that we do that, you know, that we make sure that that girls all over the globe don't just fall off the radar.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm going to hand over to Isma for one thought on that, and then Kim, and then we're going to close. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. I think something practical that we can do is, because often sexism is so entrenched in the system that sometimes we might not even realize it. So I think feminism actually loses out when people see it and they just ignore it, or they don't say anything, because then actually nothing's being done. Something that I do think that, well, something that I've personally sort of started off with feminism is just having those conversations, maybe especially when you're interviewing fellow men, just pointing it out, because sometimes it not only starts those conversations, but it's also a move in the right direction. People might not even realize that actually what they've said is wrong. So it's about educating. It goes back to educating as well. But yeah, I think that's just something.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Isma. Fantastic. And Kim, finally.
I think everything's pretty much been said there, which is brilliant. I think there is a time and a place for overtly being a feminist and wearing that badge with pride. I think that's absolutely right. But I also think there is room, as Valerie alluded to, for a bit of feminism by stealth. And that is also by being visible. And it's by, you know, surrounding yourself with a range of women from different backgrounds who've got different things to offer. And just that visibility, I think, is really important. And I think absolutely, again, you know, the big things, if you're in a position where you can change some of the big stuff, absolutely you need to use it. So if it's in that the political arena or as a community leader or whatever it is, do those things. But the day-to-day things as well, you know, treating young girls and young boys the same, doing all the things that, you know, we've all got in our day-to-day lives that can make a difference. So yeah, and I think, you know, knowing that you are part of something really special by being a feminist, like, and this what tonight has made me feel really like, you know, this is a family and where we've all got each other. So even though we're out there in the real world and sometimes it can be tough to challenge things, we've all got each other, and just remember that.
Wow, well, I'm really sorry to have to draw this to a close now. So I would like to thank all of our fantastic inspirational women tonight, Valerie, Julie, Adele, Kim and Isma for tonight's webinar. Thank you also to the audience for joining us. And last but not least, a big thank you to Leanne Monchuk for organising this event, without which it would not have taken place. And thank you also to Andy Bairstow, Andy Mycock and Li-Jie Yang for working so hard behind the scenes. Without those people, none of this would have happened. I hope you found it both an interesting, important and inspiring discussion. It would be great if you could complete a short survey on tonight's webinar that will be put in the chat for you now. And our next event, I'm delighted to say, is on the 31st of March, and it's entitled I Had to Dig Deep, Isolation Experiences of Mothers Living Apart from Their Children During the Pandemic. If you're keen to find out about more events and wish to join the mailing list, please email Li-Jie Yang and follow us on Twitter at ResearchIsAce. Thank you, everybody, and good evening. Stay safe.